Where is everybody? We rode right in.
They took all the guns and rode away. Oh, darling. I thought you were...
Don't ever be afraid of him. He's my friend.
Lila, he's an outlaw.
Not an outlaw, Mrs. Kilgore. Please believe your daughter. I am a friend.
Angry Horse wanted to kill me. He wouldn't let him. And then he made all the Indians promise not to fight, no matter what.
They'll have to fight. They've no choice. My husband's men are gathering the ranchers right now to lead them to the reservation.
Gathering where?
At Pilgrim Crossing.
Lila, I know how brave you are. Are you too tired to go on being brave?
What do we have to do?
Mrs. Kilgore, if your husband makes that attack, no ranch in this territory will be safe. It's best if the both of you go to the mission church. It's a long run. Not easy. Certainly not easy for you, Mrs. Kilgore.
I'll survive.
Well, you just depend on me. If anything happens...
If anything happens, I'll protect you. And it's about time.
You hurry and pack your things.
Or lease in the morning.
Mike Radich here, and I'm now joined on the phone by actress Beverly Washburn. Beverly, how are you?
I'm fine. Thank you for having me on your show. How are you?
Beverly, I'm doing great. I've been a fan of The Lone Ranger all my life, and this year is the 85th anniversary of The Lone Ranger, and on January 30th, 1933, he debuted on radio, and in 1956, you were in the greatest Lone Ranger movie of all time, The Lone Ranger, or Lone Ranger the Movie, as I like to call it, with Clayton Moore and Jay Silverheels. So I'm on cloud nine right now. It's an honor and a privilege to be speaking with you today because I'm such a big fan of this movie and your performance in it.
Oh, thank you for saying that. That's so sweet. It's my pleasure. I was thrilled when you contacted me to do this so that I can be a part of it because The Lone Ranger has always been dear to my heart, you know, and so when I got cast in that, I was very excited, you know, because I was young, and so for me, he was really the Lone Ranger. I wasn't that privy to who Clayton Moore was. I just kind of knew him as the Lone Ranger, and so that was a thrill for me to get that part.
Is it true your parents named you Beverly because you were born in Beverly Hills?
You must have heard that on the Jack Benny show.
Yeah, it's a good thing you weren't born in Pismo Beach.
Right, isn't that funny? I know. Back in those days, the comedy was so just innocent and pure, and, you know, now the world has changed, and you know, it's kind of a different kind of comedy, and no, that's not true. I was they couldn't think of a name for me, and I was the fifth child, and I came very late in life. My mother thought she had the flu, and it turned out she was pregnant with me, and I was born on Thanksgiving Day. But they were sitting at the breakfast table, and at the time there was a dairy company called the Beverly Dairy Company. So it's not very glamorous, but I was named after a dairy company.
Oh.
They like the name for whatever reason, so.
Now, when people talk about great Western movies, they talk about movies like High Noon, Stagecoach, The Searchers, a movie you were in called Shane, My Darling Clementine, Once Upon a Time in the West, The Wild Bunch, Tombstone, movies like that. When people talk about great Western movies, they talk about those movies, but they never mention Lone Ranger the movie. And it's a crime. Lone Ranger the movie, with Clayton Moore and Jay Silverheels, is just as good as any of those films I just mentioned. This is one of the best Westerns I've ever seen. This might be the most underrated Western of all time. It's got everything you could possibly want for a Western movie. It's got better action than all of those movies. That is not even up for debate. You look at the action in this movie with Clayton Moore, Jay Silverheels, and yourself. This movie has some of the best action scenes ever in a Western. It's simultaneously awesome and kind of sad that a movie from 1956 has better action in it than a movie from 2013. The Lone Ranger with Johnny Depp and Armie Hammer can't hold a candle to this movie. So it's kind of cool that this movie still holds up and is still really good, but at the same time, it's kind of sad. You would think with all this CGI and all this stuff that they could produce a better movie in 2013 than they did in 1956. So it's simultaneously cool and sad at the same time. But this movie is one of the greatest Westerns I've ever seen. It's got everything you could possibly want. It's got action. It's got a great story. It's got great actors. Everyone, yourself, Clayton Moore, Jay Silverheels, everyone's at the top of their game. And you have the Lone Ranger, who's the quintessential Western hero, one of the greatest characters ever created. And we have the two actors who were the definitive Lone Ranger and the definitive Tonto at the top of their game in one movie. And this movie is just a masterpiece. Amazing from start to finish. The beginning of the movie where the Lone Ranger rides up and he rears the horse up and he comes back down, and then the main title credit comes on, the Lone Ranger, and in the O circles the Lone Ranger. The Lone Ranger's in the O, and the William Tell Overture comes on. Just fantastic. I'm getting goosebumps just talking about it. It's such a great opening to the movie. So, the Lone Ranger movie has basically been cast to the side and just treated as, an extension of the TV series or a kid's movie or whatever. But this is really an adult movie. This is really an adult Western. When people think of the Lone Ranger, they put him in that same box as Hopalong Cassidy, Roy Rogers, Gene Autry, The Range Rider, Annie Oakley. They put it in the same box as those shows because those shows were the kid Westerns. The adult Westerns are the shows like Lawman, Gunsmoke, Cheyenne, Maverick, Have Gun Will Travel, Wanted Dead or Alive. Those TV shows are the adult Westerns, and people have put the Lone Ranger in that box because this movie overlaps the TV series, so they view this movie just as a kid movie. But there's a lot of adult themes in this movie. The relationship between you and your father specifically is what I'm talking about here, because that's an adult theme. I've watched this movie as a kid. Now I've grown up and I continue to watch this movie because I love this movie so much. I probably watch it 2 or 3 times a year, so I always catch different things that I didn't see before. But this relationship that you and your father have in this movie, that's not for kids. That's a very adult theme. So this movie gets a bad rap, and I would say that this movie is the most underrated Western of all time because it doesn't get the love that those other movies that I mentioned earlier get. But this movie, pound for pound, it matches up well with any of those movies I just mentioned. The action alone is worth the price of admission, from the hanging scene where the Lone Ranger has to go in and save Tonto to the fight in the Indian village between Clayton Moore and Michael Ansara, and then the ending fight between Clayton Moore and Robert Wilkie. This movie is as good as it gets. Clayton Moore and Jay Silverheels are as good as it gets. This movie is just fantastic from top to bottom. It's one of the greatest Western movies I've ever seen, and I show this movie to everyone who wants to get involved in Westerns. There's a lot of people I come in contact with, hey, I want to get involved in Westerns. I haven't seen many. I'm not really a big fan, but I want to get involved. What should I watch? What are some movies that I should check out that would probably get me interested in the genre? And I always say, go watch from 1956, Lone Ranger the movie. Go watch this movie, and you'll be a fan of Westerns. It's that good of a movie, and it's worked so far. So far, I've had many people convert into fans of Westerns, or at the very least just convert into a fan of the Lone Ranger from watching this movie. This movie, it's as advertised. I'm not making stuff up. Like, this movie is as good as I'm saying it is. It's just a movie that I've been in love with ever since I first saw the movie, so I like to watch it a few times a year because I'm such a big fan of it. Now, I don't expect you to have seen this movie 2 or 3 times this year or, last year or whatever. I don't expect you to have seen this movie that many times, but give me an idea. When was the last time you watched this movie?
Oh, gosh. It's been years. It's been a long time. I don't even remember exactly. It's weird to watch yourself, so I have a lot of my shows that I've done that kind people have sent me, on a DVD, but it's weird for me to sit and watch myself. But I will say it was one of my favorite roles for many reasons. It was just a thrill to be, working with the Lone Ranger and Tonto too, and we went on location. We filmed the majority of the film in Kanab, Utah, and for anybody that knows me or has read my book, they know that I'm a huge animal lover. I always have rescue animals, and so there's an organization called Best Friends, and they're a huge animal sanctuary, and they they rescue animals from all over the country. And it's so funny because where they are located now is the actual spot where we filmed The Lone Ranger, in the scene where the Indian children are taunting me, and we were on location there. And now, all these years later, Best Friends Animal Sanctuary is where The Lone Ranger was filmed, which is ironic because I'm a supporter of Best Friends, and it was just kind of a weird coincidence. All those years later, they would build an animal sanctuary on that very spot.
What are the odds of that happening? I'd say things have definitely come full circle.
Yeah. So.
The filming of this movie took place in between Season 4 and Season 5 of the Lone Ranger TV series, and starred the 2 actors who were the leads on that show, Clayton Moore and Jay Silverheels. So I like to call this movie Lone Ranger the Movie. I think it's a very fitting title because in 1966, Adam West and Burt Ward, the actors who played Batman and Robin on TV, made a movie called Batman the Movie. In 2009, Miley Cyrus made a Hannah Montana movie called Hannah Montana the Movie. And all these shows/movies had the same setup because they were made in between seasons of their show. So that's why I like to call this movie that. People don't like that I call this movie Lone Ranger the Movie because it's not the official title, but it gets a little bit confusing considering the 2003 movie with Chad Michael Murray and the 2013 movie with Johnny Depp and Armie Hammer also have the same title as this movie. So that's why I've taken it upon myself to change the title of this movie, and who knows, maybe it'll catch on and become official one day, but who knows. Now, in the movie, you played Lila Kilgore, the daughter of brains-heavy Reese Kilgore, and this was a role that you were born to play. I say that because you look like you actually could be the daughter of Lyle Betger and Bonita Granville. This is all-around perfect casting. Just curious, how did you get the role? Did you have to audition? Did they even call it an audition back then, or was it still an interview? Because really, in those days, an audition was like if you were in a musical or a play and you had to do some sort of dance number or singing or whatever. Did you have to interview for the part, or did they just call you up and say, hey, we want you to be in this movie?
It's so funny that you would know that because it's true. Back then, an agent would call and they would never say, we have an audition for you. It was always, we have an interview for you. And basically you would be sent to the casting and they would kind of interview, they would ask you what you've done and, what your credits were, and they'd have you read for the role and all that. So I went on the interview, and I was very blessed because I worked quite a bit as a child, and once I would work at one studio or for one particular casting director or director or whatever, oftentimes they would just call me directly to do the role, and I wouldn't even have to read for it, so that was really nice. But I had never worked at Warner Brothers, so my agent called and sent me on the interview to meet with the casting people. And, of course, I was thrilled knowing that it was the Lone Ranger, and I was so hoping that I would get the part. So, you go in and you read, and then they kind of just, they will let you know type thing,
Mm-hmm.
And then it was the next day, I guess it was, that my agent called and said that I had been chosen. And I was so thrilled because there were so many other little girls, vying for the same role, and they would have been perfect in it, And the fact that they chose me, I was very grateful.
I have a picture of you during a costume test for this movie. It's a great photo. You're wearing the outfit you wore in the scene when the governor first arrives at the Kilgore Ranch, and then in the next scene when you guys are having dinner with him. I like this photo because it gives us a rare behind-the-scenes look at this movie, which obviously doesn't have the type of behind-the-scenes coverage that a modern-day movie has. So I think it's really cool that we get this behind-the-scenes look at the process. Nowadays, it would be on DVD because they film all this kind of stuff, but this movie was made in the 50s, so we don't have that option available. So this photo is the best thing that we can find from that. So I think it's really cool. Now, did they test you with Clayton Moore or Benita Granville or the other actors who appear in this movie? Or did they just have you read lines with the director or a production assistant or somebody? What exactly went on during this interview?
No, they didn't test me. They just had me read for the role. A lot of times they would do a screen test, but for whatever reason I didn't, they didn't go that far. They just had me read for the role. But interesting you should mention the wardrobe thing because, this movie, is like 100 years old. And so that's how they did it back then. Of course, in today's world, they just take a quick digital photo of you, but back then it was a whole procedure where they would put the scene number and the character's number and the actor's name and all of that, and then they would keep it on file so that if there was a reshoot, they could go back and pull what the actor was wearing, and then the wardrobe would have to be approved by the casting people and producer and director and all that. So it was a whole procedure, and that's how they did it back then. But now they just do a quick, digital because the world of technology, it's changed a lot over the years.
Your book, Real Tears, that's real, like film reel, so R-E-E-L. On the cover of your book, Real Tears, in the top right corner, there's a picture of you and Clayton Moore from this movie. So it's obvious this movie holds a special place in your heart because, A, you agreed to let me interview you and talk all about making it, and B, you put a photo from the movie on the cover of your book. So it's obvious this movie means a lot to you, but back then, when you were making it, was it a big deal for you to be a part of this project?
Oh, it meant the world. I was a huge fan of the Lone Ranger, and so that was a thrill for me to even have the opportunity to go and read for it because, you're sent on these interviews and you don't get every role. At least, it's not, there's so many people, trying out for the same role, and so knowing that it was going to be the Lone Ranger, that was a huge thrill for me, and it was just a wonderful experience for me, and one that, I've always treasured, and I always smile, and I'm so happy when I hear that people are fans of it, because there's so many different genres, be it Western and sci-fi and horror films and dramas and comedies, and I was so fortunate to have been able to do, all of those. I did Westerns, I did comedies, sci-fi, with Star Trek, and, of course, Superman in the Moment, and so each one was just really dear to my heart, but the Lone Ranger was, it's like, I can't say that I have one favorite, because I had so many favorites, but it was certainly in the top 5 of my favorites. As an actress, you obviously pretty much want every role you go out for, because especially if you love doing what you do, and I've always enjoyed acting. So I can't say there was ever a part that I didn't want, with the exception of one, because the producer scared me, because he was this big, gruff man, and that was for a show called Telephone Time. And it seems like almost every role that I ever did or read for, I would have to cry. And, that's why, my book came out called Real Tears, because, I don't know what it was, but it just seemed inevitably I would get called for an interview for a part that, I would have to cry. I don't know why. But anyway, so this one role on Telephone Time, no matter how hard I would cry or scream or whatever, the producer just kept saying, no, more. And he was this big, gruff man, and his name was Jerry Stagg, and he was the producer. Well, I kept thinking, I was young, I was probably 8 or 9, and he kind of frightened me because he had this kind of gruff persona. And when I left, I thought, I don't really want this part because I don't think he likes me, and I didn't do a very good job because no matter what I did, he kept saying more. So I was actually hoping that I wouldn't get that part. That was the only part. Well, then the next day, I got a call from my agent saying that I had gotten the part, and I was kind of surprised because I didn't think he liked me and that I didn't do a very good job. Well, it was strange because I did that part, and it was a part where I come in screaming. So he came over, and he said, I want you to take this jump rope, and I want you to keep jumping rope until you're completely out of breath. And then, when you're out of breath, just look at me and nod, and I'll know that you're ready. And then as you come in the door, I want you to scream and cry and just go over the top as much as you can. So I did that, and when they said cut, I looked over, and here was this very large, kind of intimidating-looking man, and he had tears coming down his face. And he ran over, and he picked me up, and he swung me around, and I thought, I guess he liked it. I was so happy. And then he said to my mother, he said, I want you to come to my office on Thursday or whatever day it was, because I want to talk to you about something. So I think I did write about this in my book, and so I went we didn't know what he wanted, and I went to his office, as he had directed us to, and we sat down, and he said that he had a role. It was a part called, it was a show called The Key, and it was going to be starring Kevin McCarthy. And he said, I never thought I could find a little girl that would be able to do this role, and now I know I have. And so it was just kind of a weird turn of events, because the one role I didn't want to have, I got, and through that, I got the other role, and I got to work with Kevin McCarthy, and it was The Key, in which I played the role of a little girl named Laura Bridgman. It was based on a true story, because years later, Laura Bridgman was one of Helen Keller's teachers. And so, anyway, that was a long story that I just told you, but that was probably the only role I didn't want. But there were some roles that I wanted even more so than the others, and, one, of course, was the Lone Ranger, because I was a Lone Ranger fan. Another one was Superman and the Mole Men, because I love Superman. Mm-hmm. And then when I became an adult, I wanted the role in Spider Baby, because I loved Lon Chaney Jr., and it was a real stretch for me, the role, because I kill people. And so I really wanted that. And then, of course, Old Yeller, because, I'm a big animal lover. So those were the main ones that I really, really wanted more than any of them. So I'm sorry, that was a really long answer, wasn't it?
No. You're fine. This is great. I could listen to you talk all day. It's fine. And I think the listeners would actually prefer if I stopped talking and you just took over.
Oh, you're so funny. Thank you. I feel so blessed that I look back over my childhood, and at the time, when you're young, you don't have the same concept as when you're older. Like working with Jack Benny, I didn't know who Jack Benny was, and yet I, stayed in touch with him up until the time of his death, and I traveled with him. We toured all over the East Coast. We played Vegas and Lake Tahoe in an act that started on the Hollywood Palace, and I worked with him several times because I didn't really know. It's like I was directed by Cecil B. DeMille in The Greatest Show on Earth. Well, when you're 8 years old, I didn't know who Cecil B. DeMille was, and I was directed by George Stevens and Shane and Frank Capra, and I didn't appreciate that because I was too young to really get that, to know. And so it was when I became an adult that I could say, oh my goodness, I was so blessed and so fortunate, because I really didn't even appreciate it at the time. I was just too young to understand that whole thing, and like working with George Reeves. I didn't know who George Reeves was, but I sure knew who Superman was, and so that was a thrill. And so I just feel that I'm very lucky, but I appreciate it now so much more as an adult and looking back. So that's my story.
In Lone Ranger the movie, all your scenes take place in one of three locations: the Kilgore Ranch, the Indian Reservation, or the Mission Church. Some of your scenes take place inside on a soundstage, and some of your scenes take place outside on location, but were they all filmed in Kanab, Utah?
Some of it was actually on the Warner Brothers lot, and on a stage, and then some of it was done on location in L.A., like out, I don't know if you're familiar with the Los Angeles, but like in the valley. I think it was, I call Iverson's Ranch or something like that.
Now, there's a scene in this movie where your character is at the ranch and Reese Kilgore is giving you a riding lesson, but word on the street is the girl riding the pony in that scene is a stunt person and not you. Now, say it ain't so, Bev.
So many people said, how was it riding off on that pony? Well, unfortunately, that was not me. I wanted so much to be on the pony. They show me getting on, but because of insurance purposes, they wouldn't allow me, just in case I would fall off, there'd be an accident, or the pony would, go too, whatever it was. And I was so disappointed because, of course, I really wanted to be on that pony. So they had a little person, and then they had the wardrobe, like two sets of, my wardrobe, and so they put on her the same outfit that I had been wearing a copy of, and so it switches over, like it's me getting on the pony, but then as it's riding off, it was not me. It was, and I was so sad about that. I really wanted to do it, but they just wouldn't allow me because I was a minor, and they couldn't take a chance of anything going wrong. So when you see the movie and you see me riding off, it's not me, darn it.
You never did the figure eight. It's so sad.
No. When you see it off in the distance, that wasn't me, and I really wanted to. It would have been a lot of fun, but, they have their rules, and, being a minor, they have what's called a welfare worker on the set, and they're from the Los Angeles Board of Education, and they're called welfare workers because basically they're to look out for the welfare of the child, the minor, so you have to have 3 hours of schooling. They can't pull you out of the little school. They make like a makeshift school, like in a dressing room, and they have a teacher from the Los Angeles Board of Education, and you have to have at least 20-minute increments. In other words, you can't sit down to do a math problem and then they come and get you if you've only been in there 5 minutes or whatever. It has to be at least 20 minutes, and you have to do 3 hours. Then they make sure that you have an hour for lunch, that you don't have overtime, and things like that. You know, they're there to protect you. So because the welfare worker and all that, she would not allow me to, and they wouldn't because of insurance reasons. So, because I've had so many people say, "Oh, is it fun to ride the pony?" You know, and it would have been had they let me. But anyway.
It's too bad you didn't get to do that scene, because in real life you're really a good rider. So that's why a lot of people think it's you in the movie. And because you're such a good rider, it seems like a no-brainer to have you do that scene at the ranch. But rules are rules, I guess, and you can't go against the rules.
The rules. Yeah, like when I worked with Ward Bond on Wagon Train, he was used to being around a lot of guys all the time. It was always mostly men. And so he had a really foul mouth, and he didn't mean to. It would just roll out of his mouth, you know. And I was young. It didn't bother me. I didn't know what the words even meant. And but he would constantly be doing that. So the welfare worker at one point went to the director and said, if he, you know, uses one more swear word, I'm yanking her from the set. And she had that much authority, you know, because she was there to look out for my welfare. So they had a talk with Ward Bond, and he didn't even realize he'd been doing it. You know, it just rolled out of his mouth without even thinking. And so he came over and apologized and all that. You know, it didn't really bother me because I didn't even know he was, you know, the bad words meant at the time. But anyway, so after that, he never even said darn, because they would have, you know, made me leave. And I had a really big role. It was when I was working in an episode called The Tobias Jones Story with Lou Costello. I don't know if you saw that one.
Sure, I've seen it. I believe it was his one and only dramatic role.
Yeah. So I was on, you know, I had quite a large role, so I was there, you know, the whole day, and so it would have really messed up their shooting schedule if she pulled me from the set, and that's what she said she would do if he said another swear word. So he never did after that, and he was really a nice man, too. And he didn't mean anything by it. It was just, you know, he was a big old Western cowboy, and he, you know, talked like that in front of all the guys without thinking.
When you were making The Lone Ranger, were you there for the entire filming of the movie, or because of the rules and regulations, did you just film your scenes and that was it?
No, I wasn't there the whole time. I mean, when we were in Kanab, and if there would be a scene without me, you know, I would just be at the hotel, and then they'd have me when they needed me. But typically, you know, the scenes that I was not in, I didn't have to go to the set that day.
Okay, now we're getting to the good stuff, because it's not every day we get a chance to talk to people who knew and worked with our heroes, Clayton Moore and Jay Silverheels. So let's start with Clayton Moore. What was it like working with him?
Just wonderful. I mean, he was so nice and made me feel so welcome to be a part of the movie. You know, he didn't ever, like, dismiss me or, you know, act like he didn't care, whatever. He was always just a gentleman, just pleasant and sweet, and made it a wonderful experience. And it was a thrill for me, because before I even got that role, I was already, you know, a big Lone Ranger fan. And then to go on that interview and get chosen was a real thrill for me. And I feel very grateful, and I'm always so happy when people, you know, at various conventions, you know, there's a lot of autograph shows that go on around the country, and I love it when people, you know, come up and talk about the Lone Ranger and how it's one of their favorites and things like that, and I feel so lucky that I could have been a part of it. You know, it was just something that I feel that I was quite blessed, quite fortunate, quite lucky. It was just all those things, and I feel grateful that I was able to do the thing that I love doing, you know. He was great. I remember one time we had the day off, and we were at the hotel, And so we were all at the pool, and a fan somehow had heard that he was going to be there, so she recognized him, even though people never saw him without his mask, but she figured it out that it was, Clayton Moore. So she went up to him and she asked him if she could pose for a picture with him. So he said, sure, and he quickly grabbed his mask and put it on. Right. And I remember, and I wrote about this in the book, because it was such a funny sight to see, because here's this, man in swimming trunks and his Lone Ranger mask, because it was in his contract that he wasn't allowed to be photographed without wearing it, and he always abided by that rule. But it was just kind of comical at the time for me, because I was young, and to see him in, swimming trunks and a mask. But because I saw him without the mask. He just wasn't allowed to be photographed without it. So anyway, that was fun. I remember that so vividly. But he was terrific. He was so nice to me and made me feel so welcome. And so it was one of my fondest memories as a child. So I'm so glad that you enjoyed the movie and that there are Lone Ranger fans, still out there. I was doing a Western convention a few years back, and there was a family, and they had 4 little boys, and they came to the convention, and all the little boys were dressed up like the Lone Ranger. And it was the cutest thing, and the parents said that they were just huge fans of the Lone Ranger, and I thought, that's so wonderful, because this was just a few years ago, and nowadays kids are so involved with their Xbox and their videos and, all that, and to see that these little boys were just, in their Lone Ranger costumes, it was just so adorable.
Now, Clayton Moore, like you mentioned, he could never be photographed without his mask. If he was doing a public appearance, he could never be without the mask on. He had to be the Lone Ranger in public. Do you remember the first time that you saw him without the mask? And obviously, you were a Lone Ranger fan before you did this movie. What was your reaction to seeing him without the mask? Because I'm sure you had never seen him not as the Lone Ranger before. So what was it like seeing him without the mask the first time you saw him without the mask on?
It was exciting. He was actually a very handsome man.
Right.
Yeah, and so, I was too young to be flirting with him. It
sure.
was that, but I just thought what a nice-looking man he was, So that was kind of a thrill for me that I got to see him without his mask on. And, he could be without his mask. He just wasn't allowed to be photographed. So I would see him, in the makeup room, and without his mask. And then when we go to the set, then, of course, he had to put it on. Yeah, I'm thrilled that, that there's still a huge fan base for the Lone Ranger, and I'm thrilled that I got to be a part of the movie. It wasn't that big a part of the movie, but it was a part of it, and I'm grateful for that.
Now, during the filming of this movie, when Clayton Moore was mounting a horse, you saw a side of him that we've never seen.
Yes, there's a funny story about that in my book. I don't know if that's what you were referring to.
Tell it.
Well, that costume that he wore was very tight, and so apparently he didn't wear any underwear. And so there was a scene where he mounts, Silver, and he's riding off. Well, what happened is when he got on Silver, his pants split open. And the director, just to be funny, I guess, instead of saying cut right then, because obviously they couldn't use that in the movie, he thought it was hilarious. So he didn't tell them to stop. He let the film still roll, and so they had it all on film, not for publication, but for, back in the day they used to call it the rushes, and at the end of each day they would show what they had filmed. Now, in today's world, they call it the dailies, but back then it was the rushes and all the, not typically the cast, unless it was the main star, but typically like the producer, director, and casting, and a couple writer and whatever would go in and they would watch what they had filmed for that day. And so when his pants I was, young, but it was very funny. And so then the running gag on the set became, it was, the Lone Ranger mooning everybody as he ran off into the sunset. So it was kind of a funny sight to see, but which I never forgot. So anyway, he took it all in stride. He had a good sense of humor, and because after, when he was finally gone, and then he got off and he realized that his pants had split, and then everybody was, all the crew and everybody, were laughing, and then he realized, that they had let the camera roll the whole time he was like that. It was pretty funny.
What was it like working with Jay Silverheels?
Oh, he was great. He was very soft-spoken, very kind of reserved and quiet, but always very gentlemanly and very nice to me. And, every morning on the set, I'd always get a hug from him as well as Clayton Moore, and that was a thrill for me. He was so nice, and so was Jay Silverheels. They treated me so well, and it's nice to kind of look up to somebody and then find out in real life that they're even more than what you anticipated or had hoped for. He was just so nice, and they both were.
What was it like working with Benita Granville?
Benita Granville was such a lovely lady and wonderful woman, sweet, genteel, just, beautiful, kind, and I loved working with her.
What was it like working with Lyle Betger?
He was fine. I can't say that we had a real rapport. He was, he was fine, never a problem, but I can't say we had this wonderful, warm connection. Basically we'd do a scene together, and then I'd be called off to go to school, and it was more business-like with him. I'm not saying anything bad about him. He was perfectly fine, but certain people kind of go the extra mile to give you a hug, or
right,
talk to you more or whatever. But I guess because I was just a child, he didn't pay that much attention to me, really.
All right, Lila, come here, dear. Man, that's wonderful. That's wonderful, boy. Let's give him a little breather now, huh? I think he's tired. You raise them like boys, they'll be boys.
I'm going to brand a calf this roundup.
You are, huh? I've got a big outfit here, Governor. You've only seen a corner of it. And this is the youngster who someday is going to be able to run it. I'm raising her to be equal to the job.
Reese, you can't make a boy of her. It may be what you wanted, but it's not what we have.
I think I know what I'm doing. And I'm telling you for the last time not to interfere.
Maybe he was sad that you weren't a boy, just like in the movie.
Maybe. I don't know.
Benita Granville, she's the wife of Jack Rather. He's the gentleman who owned the rights to the Lone Ranger character at the time. Did you meet him? And if so, what was he like?
I did not get to meet him. He was never on the set that I could recall.
And finally, what was it like working with Michael Ansara?
Also very nice. He had that kind of intimidating look, He was a little bit scary to me at first because I was so young, but he was great. He was as nice as he could be.
Now, you mentioned it a few times that you're a very big animal lover. Usually on movies like this where there's animals, they usually use multiple animals. Now, when you did Old Yeller, Spike, the dog who played Old Yeller in that movie, he did everything. But usually when you're working on shows with animals like Rin Tin Tin or Lassie, they have multiple dogs or multiple animals portray whatever the animal is in that movie.
Yeah, like with German Shepherds and Collies, they, so many of them look exactly the same.
Right.
And there might be one dog that, maybe they run better, or one of them listens more so, or they sit or heel or do whatever it is better than the other. And plus, they never wanted to overwork the dog, so they would bring in whatever dog was better at the particular, thing that needed to be done on that day. But with Old Yeller, they got him out of an animal shelter. He was a rescue dog. And his real name, as you know, was Spike. And so there was only one of him, and so he did everything. He was a great dog, and the Weatherwax family, they were pretty much had the market cornered on anything with animals, and so they trained him. And there's a book out now called 4 Feet to Fame, which is kind of a clever title because it's about Lassie and the dogs and all that, because they have 4 feet, and it was a Weatherwax. It's about the Weatherwax family, and they asked me to do the foreword for it, which was really nice of them, and I was honored. So that book's available also on Amazon, and it's called 4 Feet to Fame, about the Weatherwax family who, pretty much did any movies or TV shows where there was a dog or cat involved.
In this movie, Silver, the horse, how many horses are you aware of it? Maybe you know the answer, maybe you don't know the answer, but how many horses did they use in the movie, and did you have any interactions with the horse? Did you pet it? Did you ride it? Any of that kind of stuff?
No, they would not allow me to do any riding. I couldn't even ride the pony. But as I recall, it was just one, just Silver. He was the star. But, they always made sure that, people from the Humane Society would be there and, be kind to them. But, I wasn't really allowed as a minor to really have any interaction. And, certainly I wasn't allowed to ride him or anything, but he was such a beautiful horse.
Spoken of everywhere. Red Hawk is a sick man, an angry horse who wishes to become chief. Shows his strength by making war on children.
The birds talk of it. The animals in the forest laugh at Angry Horse.
Is Red Hawk so weak that Angry Horse can do as he wishes? Or is Angry Horse obeying Red Hawk's commands?
Red Hawk not like bring white child here.
Why do you keep her here? Let me take her away.
Red Hawk, no more tell what do. Red Hawk old, no more fight. Angry Horse not old. Better Angry Horse be chief.
Always the young buffalo wishes to kill the old buffalo and take his place. And he does kill the old buffalo because he has youth and strength. But has he the wisdom to lead the herd? To keep it out of danger? I say Angry Horse has not the wisdom. He cannot be the chief of a tribe that wishes to live in peace. I will fight Angry Horse to prove he is not worthy. This white child must belong to the winner. A squaw can fight with weapons. The chief must be strong in heart, in his hands. I do not need weapons to fight men who make war on children.
I have so many favorite scenes from this movie, but if I had to narrow it down to just one, I would say my favorite scene from this movie is the fight between Clayton Moore and Michael Ansara. I just think that was a great fight scene from start to finish. During your career, you were known as the Queen of the Criers, and in this movie, you don't disappoint us, because when we first see you at the Indian Village, the Indian children are teasing you and taunting you. You're so good in this scene and in this movie. Your performance is outstanding. In this scene, it really feels like you're really scared that Angry Horse is going to beat the Lone Ranger and the Indians are going to keep you. And it's such a great scene. And it's, top to bottom, the drama's there, the action is there, everything in this scene is working perfectly. So if I had to say, I guess that would be my favorite scene in this movie, because I do have a lot of favorite scenes. I mean, it's one of my favorite all-time movies, Lone Ranger the movie from 1956, so it's very hard for me to narrow it down to just one scene, but if I had to do it, it would be the fight between Clayton Moore and Michael Ansara. And as a bonus, it's great because I'm a huge fan of both those guys. I love Clayton Moore and I love Michael Ansara. I love Michael Ansara in Broken Arrow and Law of the Plainsman, where he played Sam Buckhart, because that was a spin-off from another Western show that I really love called The Rifleman. So I love that guy, and I love him as a villain. I think he's stellar in this movie. There's also episodes of the Lone Ranger TV series that he did, and he was fantastic in those. There's an episode with Clayton Moore and Jay Silverheels called Trouble at Black Rock, and he's one of the villains in that episode. It's from season 2, and then in season 3, when John Hart took over the role as the Lone Ranger, there's an episode early season 3 called Outlaw Underground, and he's one of the villains in that, and he's awesome in that episode also. And he also got to complete the set in this movie, because in a movie called Brave Warrior, he fights Jay Silverheels in an Indian village. And in this movie, he fights Clayton Moore in an Indian village. So he's able to get both Lone Ranger and Tonto. And of course, because he's fighting the Lone Ranger and Tonto, he lost both those fights. So I thought that was very interesting. But this is definitely my favorite scene from the movie. So I'm very curious in hearing your memories of this scene. So what do you remember about filming that scene?
Well, from the get-go, when I would act, I would know that it was, my mother used to call it play acting, that it wasn't really real, although I was always taught to try to put myself in that situation so it would appear to be real. And, people would say to me, well, how did you cry? And, and I always said, well, if you pretend you're that person, invariably when I would supposed to be cry, it was obviously for a reason. So I would pretend that's what was actually happening, and it would make me cry. But I wasn't scared or anything. I tried to, I was supposed to act scared, but I knew that we were just play acting, basically. And, we rehearsed it a couple times, and so I knew nothing bad was going to happen. But it was fun. It was just, I always enjoyed acting, and that scene was, kind of exciting. So especially when the Lone Ranger is there to save me, that in itself was pretty exciting.
What's your favorite scene from the movie?
I don't know if I have a favorite. They were all fun scenes to do. I love being there every day. I loved, getting up at home and knowing that I was going to work and that I was going to be there with the Lone Ranger and, do what I love to do. And so I can't pin down one scene. They were all fun. There weren't any scenes that I didn't enjoy doing. So, but it was fun to be in Kanab, Utah, and the beautiful scenery there, and the mountains and stuff. And it was just a really pleasant, wonderful experience that I will always hold dear to my heart.
Two things that have always puzzled me about your career, because yes, you worked with and were very close with Loretta Young and Jack Benny. You were close to them for many years. Even after you worked with them, you still stayed in contact with them. But the person who actually, I guess you could say, discovered you was Jock Mahoney. But for whatever reason, you never worked on The Range Rider or Yancey Derringer, which were his two westerns. And another thing that's always puzzled me is you never worked on the Lone Ranger TV series, because there were plenty of roles before and after this movie that you appeared in that you could have played a role in. And so that always puzzled me, why you never worked on any of those shows. Just curious, why didn't you work on any of these shows?
I would have no idea. I guess they didn't want me. I don't know. I can't answer that. I mean, I would have been delighted to be on any of those shows. But I have to say, I was quite busy as a child, and I basically pretty much went from show to show. I don't know, I'd like to think maybe I was busy at the time or whatever, but I don't recall ever going on an interview for the Lone Ranger or the Range Rider and not getting it. I just never went on an interview, so I don't know. I can't really answer that. It would have been my pleasure to be on any of those shows, but it wasn't for anything like bad that happened or any falling out or anything like that. I don't know. It didn't happen.
Do you have a favorite memory from being on set making this movie?
Just to have been a part of it. I think, the Lone Ranger hopefully will live on forever. I mean, it's been around, like you said, 85 years? Yep. And so the fact that people still know about it, and I wish more children, of today would get more interested in, that kind of stuff as opposed to all the, these violent video games and stuff. But hopefully it'll live on forever. And I feel just, having been a part of it, to say that, I got to be in a Lone Ranger movie is, not everybody can say that. So I feel very fortunate. So just the whole memory, it kind of encompasses everything. Just being a part of it, is a memory that I always talk about when I do panels and things like that. And I'm so happy when I meet people that say they're a fan of the Lone Ranger.
What are you up to these days? Are you still working? Are you still rescuing animals? Are you still living in Las Vegas? What's going on in your life right now?
I've recently narrated a couple of documentaries, and every year I do 2 different shows. That one of them is in L.A., it's called Spurred Back, and the other one is in Seattle, called Reps. And it's people like Tommy Cook, if you remember him from Red Ryder, and Tony Dow, who was Wally and Leave It to Beaver, and Paul Peterson from The Donna Reed Show, and Jeannie Russell from Dennis the Menace, and Richard Hurd from The Seinfeld Show. And we get together as a group, and we do recreations of old radio programs, because sadly that's a dying thing. Back in the day, they would do all these wonderful radio shows, and people would sit around the radio, listening to these shows, and then TV came into its own, and radio kind of fizzled out, sadly. So we do that. I'm going in March, and then I'm going to be doing a podcast. It's called Stu's Show on February 13th in L.A. They're flying me there because I live in Las Vegas. And I'm doing a show called My Hollywood that we're doing here in Vegas, and we're also doing it in Kayenta, Utah in April. And it's basically kind of, what you and I are doing now, only it's live, and it's where we talk about my memories and the shows that I've been in, and it's that kind of thing. So I'm still involved. For the past couple of years, we've been trying to get the funding to do a movie that's been written is such a cute idea. It's called December Dilemma, and it would be with Richard Benjamin, who has, wanted to be a part of this for a long time, and Tony Dow and I would be playing husband and wife, and it's a very cute. It's a family film, It's about the coming of people coming together at Christmas time, because in it, Tony Dow and I have a daughter who's married to a Jewish guy, and that would be played by Ross Benjamin, who is Richard Benjamin's son. And what happens is, apparently, every 100 years or whatever, Christmas and Hanukkah come together, and it has its own website. It's called December Dilemma, and we've been trying to get the funding to get that film made, because it's a family film. It would be perfect for like Hallmark or Lifetime or something like that, because it'll make you laugh, it'll make you cry, and it's a sweet family film where married to a Jewish guy, and so every year we celebrate Christmas because his family disowned him because he married outside of the faith, and then his father dies, and his uncle, who is played by Richard Benjamin, is feeling lost, and so we invite him over, and then it's kind of like Christmas and Hanukkah collide, and it's all about coming together and realizing that everybody should just be at peace and be together as opposed to being on opposite sides. And so it's a very cute movie. So we've been hoping to get the funding going, for that, and if so, we would be doing that. And so I'm still doing it. I still, have been fortunate doing some, conventions. I've just been asked to autograph 500 new trading cards for Star Trek that will be put out by Rittenhouse Archives, and it's a trading card of me as Lieutenant Arlene Galway in the episode called The Deadly Years. So I'm still doing a little bit of things here and there and enjoying it.
Your book, Real Tears, where's the best place for fans to go if they want to buy a copy? Is Amazon the best place?
Yeah, Amazon would be the best, and there's two, but the latest one is Real Tears Take Two. The first one came out, and I was very fortunate to get a nice response, but the publisher, which is Bear Manor Media, decided they wanted me to come out with a second edition and make it bigger and have more photos and more stories. So on Amazon they have both of them, but the latest one is Real Tears Take Two, and so it's bigger and has a lot more photos and more stories. So and when they buy them, they give me my little royalty check, and I always give a portion of it to an animal charity when I get my royalty checks from it. And Tony Dow and Paul Peterson both wrote a foreword for me, and which was so sweet. They're good friends of mine, and anyway, so yeah, it is available on Amazon.com as well as Bear Manor Media. So, and I write a monthly column here in Las Vegas for a little newspaper magazine called The Vegas Voice, and it's called Hollywood Memories. So I'm still dabbling in it, I'm not sitting on my rocking chair doing nothing. So.
Well, I hope that royalty check was more than 1 cent, because I know you've gotten that in the past.
I know, it's so funny because, residuals didn't come into play until, I want to say it was 1963 or 4, something like that. And so many of the child stars, never even got residuals at all, for the old series, Leave It to Beavers and Father Knows Best and shows like that. But so most of my work was done before residuals. So every now and then I'll get some, for like Star Trek and Murder, She Wrote and Las Vegas and, some of the latter ones. But I did actually get a residual check, and it was for 1 penny, literally. And it was kind of amusing. So, anyway, but I thank you so much for your kind words, Mike, and your compliments. That means so much to me. I'm so glad that you tracked me down for this podcast so that I could be a part of it and to talk about some of my favorite memories. And I'm very appreciative, and to the people that are watching and, have an interest in the Lone Ranger and listening to me ramble on about my memories. I thank all of them, and I certainly thank you for including me on your show. I know you've interviewed a lot of people, and so I'm very honored and grateful to you, and I hope you keep doing what you're doing, and I thank you so very much for having me on your show.
Thank you for the kind words. That really means a lot coming from you. I've been a fan of yours since I was 7 or 8 years old. I've been such a big fan of the Lone Ranger for such a long time, I actually don't remember not being a fan. That's how long. I'm 25 now, but I don't remember not being a fan of the Lone Ranger, and I've loved this movie since the first time I ever saw this movie, and I'd been a fan before I saw this movie, and I saw it on VHS many, many years ago, and I didn't know that this movie was in existence because this is pre-internet, so I wasn't sure what I was watching, and I didn't know that they ever made a feature film. So when I saw this for the first time, I thought I found something like that was really rare. I was like, oh my God, this is great. I found this Lone Ranger movie. Does anyone else know that this is in existence? Like, this is the greatest thing I've ever seen, because I'd only seen the half-hour black and white shows, and now I'm seeing a full-color, feature-length motion picture. It was, I can still remember the first time I ever saw this movie, and it was just a great experience, and I still, even when I watch it today, because prepping for this interview, I've watched it like 6 or 7 times. I watched the whole movie, and then sometimes I just watch your scenes to study them, and it's still a great movie to me. It still gets me every time. So this has been a real thrill and a real treat to speak with you today. And so I just want to say thank you for taking the time to talk. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mike, and I thank you for having me. It meant a lot to me that you reached out to me, because it's always fun for me to reminisce and share my memories. So when I do these conventions and everything, and people come up and thank me, I'm always so touched by that, because I think it should be the other way around. I feel like I should be thanking you, because, without people like you, all these little memories and things would never be happening. So I thank you so very much. It really means a lot to me that you like that movie and that you like my performance, and for all your kind compliments and words. So I hope you have a wonderful day, and maybe one day our paths will cross in person. That would be wonderful.